fun. We have a lot of connections with Microsoft Teams and local West Michigan networks, right? A lot of people do this. So,
we're gonna give it a shot.
Okay.
Does it sound good?
So instead of listening to me just kind of fill time while we're getting technology, I think we're ready. I'm going to turn over to John. And John, why don't you introduce yourself in case everyone doesn't know you. And then we'll save the last 15 or so minutes after John's done for networking. And I might ask a few questions at the end as well to set up the next couple sessions. But generally, that's it. Enjoy yourselves and take it away, John.
All right. Thanks, Brian. So this topic tonight will be introducing Azure Load Testing to your CI/CD pipelines. So if you haven't, we'll go into a little bit of background on what Azure Load Testing is. We'll go ahead and show a couple different demos on how you can configure it. And for starters too, if you notice, I got a QR link and a URL out there. You can go ahead and scan the QR link. You can access the URL. What that is, it's a Microsoft site that'll pop up. You can enter information or skip it, but then it'll give you the repository I have all this information stored in, as well as just a feedback for the presentation itself. So feel free to provide that. So first up, a little bit about myself. If you don't know who I am, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, as I thought I was going to do. I am a senior cloud solutions architect for Microsoft in the HLS space. I would say concentrate more on infrastructure as code, DevOps, and Azure. Those are my certifications. Really do DevOps advocacy as well. Former Azure MVP, and I also blog, so you can feel free to follow me on that. Talk a little bit about that agenda. We're going to talk about what is Azure Load Testing. We'll do a demo of Azure Load Testing. Then we'll talk about how to include that in your DevOps processes. And then finally, we'll talk a demo about a CI/CD pipeline and where that might look. So first up, let's see if I can just do this. All right, we'll do that for now. So what is Azure Load Testing? Azure Load Testing is the native Azure tooling to simulate traffic. It leverages JMeter. If you're unfamiliar with JMeter is an open source Java application designed to load test functional behavior. You can additionally, if you don't familiar with JMeter and you want to do a simple test, you can also do it through the UI, and we'll go ahead and look through that. Another thing too with Azure Load Testing, keep in mind, it is a regional resource. What I mean by that is it's not like Front Door, it's not like DNS where I have one instance available in all regions. No, it's going to be based upon the region you deploy it into, which is kind of cool if you think about it. And let's say if I'm a global company and I have my Azure resource in East US, but I want to simulate what traffic might look like if someone hits my site over in Europe. Well, I can spin up Azure Load Testing in Europe, and it'll go ahead and execute against that JMeter script or that UI test, that simple test I mentioned. Additionally, there is some tooling available, the Azure DevOps test, which we will look at, and then there's also GitHub Actions, which we can also look at later. So one of the things when we talk anything in Azure is what's the cost? That's one of the first things we really should ask. This one, it kind of varies, to be honest. You're going to have your $10 a month, which is a baseline. So if I spin up an instance, it's going to be 10 bucks. With that 10 bucks, you get 50 virtual testing hours. What that means is that I can simulate, I'm going to have 10 users run a test for 10 minutes. 10 times 10, 100 minutes. So that's how that gets eaten away. And you can see then that you go up here, you can do up to just short of 10,000 at 15 cents an hour. And then after that, you get a price breakdown a little over 7 cents an hour. So the other thing too that's important when talking about Azure Load Testing is you're still going to pay for the compute. The compute's not free. So if I'm doing Azure Load Test, I'm going to hit a website 1,000 times. I'm going to pay for those 1,000 requests. I'm going to write Cosmos database 2,000 times. I'm going to pay for that. So that's something to be cognizant of when we're running these tests where the cost will quickly escalate potentially. So we'll get to this first demo. In this first demo, what I'm going to do is just going to pull up the Azure Load Test service. We'll go ahead and show how you can do a simple UI test. Then we'll also go ahead and pull up JMeter as well and show what the JMeter code looks like. And then we'll also view the source code behind this solution so you can kind of get a feel for that. And then we'll come back and review the test results. All right. And so first up, I'm going to actually come here to the bar, make it a little easier on myself. And I'm going to come into here, and inside Azure, I'll pull up the Azure Load Test service. All right, and this is a service that is GA. It went GA about 2-3 months ago, I want to say. So you can see here in this case, I've got one instance of the Azure Load Test service, and it's based in the East US. So if I go in and click that, this is what the screen's going to look like. So inside here, there's that, oh, get started for quick test, or I can upload a JMeter script, which is more realistically what large-scale enterprises or organizations are more likely going to do. However, I'm going to show you both here. So if I go into test here, you can see inside test, I already have a sample test here, but if I wanted to, I can hit create a quick test, and you can see the quick test, give me a URL, virtual users, a test duration, and a ramp up time. So that way I can simulate traffic ramping up. So that's it, really. So if you think about UI tests, okay, this is quick, this gets the job done, but 9 times out of 10, you're gonna be looking for something more than just this. So enter in a JMeter script. So inside here, you can see I've run this a fair amount, and if I go to configure, and I go to my configure test, we'll walk through the components here. I give it a name, you give it a description. There's a test plan, in which case it is a JMeter script that's been uploaded. I'll pull up the JMeter script. It's really simple. It's nothing overly complicated. I said it earlier, I think there's people in this room who know JMeter more than I do. Testing is not my background. It's more in that DevOps and Azure piece. So parameters, here I'm passing in what the name of the app is that JMeter is expecting to hit. My load here, I'm only going to use one engine instance. And then test criteria here. So if I wanted to, what I can do is to say, right now it's set that this test is always going to come back and say, yep, I passed. Even though there might be a whole bunch of errors, it's still going to come back and report a pass status. But let's say if I have certain threshold and say, yep, if it's taking too long to really get a response back, I can go ahead and set that as a failure, as the success criteria will be. You can also do errors, latency, those type of things. So let's go ahead and if I want to play around with this just to show you, here's an error. Aggregate function percentage, condition greater than, because who wants less than on errors? And then you can put that in there and you can save it. So with that being said, I'm going to close this and we're going to execute the test, and then I'll come back and look at some of the source code here with you, because the test will take some time, and we'll also look at the JMeter piece of it. So let me go hit here. Let me come back over here and pull up what I had open with JMeter. Throw this up here. This is the JMeter script. There's nothing really exciting about it. I probably should have also gone back and shown an architecture behind this, but it is going to be an Angular JavaScript front end that's hosted in app service, and it's talking to a Cosmos database in the back end. So with that, you can see I'm getting a timestamp. Where's my mouse? There we go. And then an add. It's just doing a post request. And if I go through here, you can see that it's going to go ahead, and how this reads is I'm going to have 10 requests per second for the first 50 seconds. Then it's going to go 50 requests per second till the end, which is cut off here. But I think it's 6 minutes, so you can see that. There it is. So there's the duration. So with that, pretty simple, but that's what's going to be executing. Let me come back here and see if we can visualize this test running right now. It's still not started. It takes a little bit for it to get going. We'll come back to it. So going back to that sample code that I was talking about, and this is publicly available. This is the Microsoft recommended sample. If you are familiar with Microsoft samples, they get the job done, but they aren't necessarily made for organizational adaptation sometimes. So that's what we'll come back to on the second demo, is how we're going to adjust for that. But it'll be the same source code, just organized a little bit different. So inside here, they put all the JavaScript and all the code in the root folder, so everything's in here. If I go through here, what it's going to do is it's got a combination of deployments, to be honest. This is handled already outside, but if I wanted to here, it's going to go ahead, and this is the ARM template for Azure Load Tester, which it'll go through and deploy. Nothing really, it's not complicated for that. So that's one part of it. And then the other part too, they provide you with a PowerShell script here that will handle the deployment if you wanted to of the app service. So you can go through this. This is just one off, like, yep, I'm gonna go ahead, I just wanna get this running. I don't have Azure DevOps, those pieces of it. If you were to jump into this, I'd recommend just using the Azure Pipelines one. But even then, again, I wouldn't say it's optimized for an organizational use. What it'll do is you put in this information, you do the stages, build. It's going to zip the entire directory up, publish the pipeline artifact, come through here, it'll deploy, doing an ARM template deployment. These are all ARM templates in this one. I know Matt gave a great presentation on Bicep. If you are torn between the two, there's really no reason I would say to go with ARM. Is you go with Bicep, because Bicep will transpile into ARM anyway. So then it's going to take connection string information here, update the Azure App Service settings. So it's going to have things like the connection string here, some of these settings. And then it's going to deploy the whole zip file. So everything in the zip file is going to be deployed to the app service. And then here is the load test stage that executes. And this will be another ARM deployment because it's going to redeploy the load test. Again, not something you probably want at the individual project level, and we'll go into that in more detail. And then this here is the Azure Load Test task. This task needs to be installed on the virtual machine you're using it on if you're doing self-hosted. If it's an Azure DevOps agent you're using, you still have to go to the marketplace and install it. And then this will finally publish the results. So at this stage, after all that, hopefully I bought enough time that you can start seeing this test execute. And so far things are looking good. I'm expecting this to start picking up some failures here soon. Hopefully more than one. So the cool thing I will say about this example though is they built it so that you will hit a bottleneck. So you can see what the load test is going to do and see it actually start to error out some of those requests. In fact, we're starting to see more of these here. Yep, so let this flush through. What this tells me is, hey, it looks like I have a bottleneck happening here. And the way this is structured is that the bottleneck is, to jump to the chase, it's going to be at the Cosmos DB on the throughput set to 400. So what I did was, rather than wait for another 6 minutes, if I go back here just to kind of show you what the difference is, if I go back to my sample test here, and I had one I marked here. This is a test I ran last night. Once I increased the throughput, you can see 0 errors, my request rate. So yeah, you can see it pretty much hummed along pretty well. I got one 500 error. Could probably look into that more. But also too, with load test, what you can do is back on the configuration piece, I can configure my metrics if I want to go to, in this case, the Microsoft Insights. And when I configure this test, I can call out those other resources. If you give me a minute here, I can add them. And again, too, you can define all this via infrastructure as code. But here in my monitoring, I can add additional resources. So the goal here, and what I would recommend is no matter what, I don't care if it's through here, I don't care if it's a secondary ones, you want this to go into a log analytics workspace. That's really where you want to be able to get that long-term reporting, preparing up metrics, those type of components of it. So we got through that, talk through briefly. Let me check on time. Okay, so some of those things I called out when we went through that code sample where it's like, that's great, this is a great demo of the product, but it doesn't actually help me use it in my organization. It's open to interpretation. So then what kind of decisions do you have to do around that based upon what we saw? What I'm throwing out here is these are just DevOps principles that I advise customers on. Every organization is different. I'm going to put that out there, and everyone has different constraints on that. So usually when I go to a greenfield customer, I would advise for good DevOps practices that have all the deployment steps automated. As in, if I take vacation, the next person can just click a button and go. They don't have to worry about, oh, John didn't tell me that I have to go update this manual connection string. Well, everything should be automated. Deployment is idempotent when possible. That's an important one too, because I don't want to have to track the status of the 4 pipelines. I should be able to track everything in one pipeline, and that's not always possible, but that should be the goal, to be able to put everything in one pipeline that's pertinent to that app. From that, next step would be for microservices. You can go ahead and do it just at the microservice level of the pipeline. So that way I'm not deploying every microservice in one pipeline. I would recommend doing like one pipeline per microservice. Infrastructure and app code deployed together. This is one that's always a stepping point, and everyone's got their own religions on this one. I say put them together. And I would say you're seeing more and more Microsoft application development teams pushing for this. Because at the end of the day, when something goes bump in the middle of the night and the developer gets that call, they want to be able to make that change and just deploy it rather than let me go call this other team, because I got to call this other team, and then we're going to go ahead and coordinate it. But there's guardrails there. There's some assumptions there. It sounds really easy in practice, but there's a lot of hurdles there. But that's something to consider. So that's going to be wrapped there. Reuse deployment steps where you can. So I pulled up that YAML pipeline. That YAML pipeline has each task what I would call hard-coded. If I go and put that in another repository, I have to copy and paste and update everything. With YAML pipelines and templates, what you can do is take each one of those tasks, create a template for it, and then just call the template, and you're good to go. So you can execute that and reuse that across your repositories. And I will show some of that. And then two, at the end of the day, there's a balance of developer empowerment versus security and audit controls. And every organization is going to be different. So you want to be able to empower your developers to build things, to support things. But you also don't want them run up an Azure bill, right? Or produce security vulnerabilities on a hardened environment. So those are things you got to consider. So how does that go into specifically Azure load testing? So inside here, SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle, talking through that for Azure load testing specifically, what I would recommend, this is my personal recommendation, would be a separate resource and a separate resource group. And here's why. Going back to that, keeping everything self-contained, this should live outside of the repository because of cost. We talked about that you're gonna get billed per cost of instance you spin up. So if I have a centralized one in a region, maybe for a larger application, maybe just for that environment region, I'm gonna go ahead and call that. So that's what I'm gonna go ahead and set that up, and then you can reuse them. So you saw I had this sample test. I can create additional tests in Azure load testing. Then too, because of that bill and everything, if my environment's at scale, I probably don't wanna run this in dev. I would argue, what's the value of running this in dev when I want to try and take the advantage of cost savings in dev? So really, it should be in a test or an alt environment is where I'd recommend that. And then also too, I would put an approval gate before that load test environment. And the reason being is from a tester perspective, I might be in the middle of a bunch of tests and then everything's just going to slow down. I'd rather have someone be able to turn that and approve that if they want to. And the second part of that too with load testing is I may not always want to run that. So I want to be able to potentially bypass. If I update a typo, running load testing, we saw it take 6-10 minutes in the middle of the night. Like if you get that page, I don't want to wait for the load test that I know is going to succeed. So what you can do is you could turn it off through a PR approval. There's ways and mechanisms to do that in your software delivery pipeline. The other thing too I'm calling out here that I probably should call out in an earlier slide is your Azure DevOps service connection is going to need to have at least the test contributor role, which is an RBAC role in Azure, RBAC role-based access control, just some other access to execute the test. And then also too, I mentioned earlier about installing the Azure load test in Azure DevOps. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through some changes that were made. And I want to keep in mind too, when I do these things, I kind of go for breadth of practices to at least get exposure. So my intention is if you walk away from this going, we're not going to use Azure load testing. Hopefully there's something else you saw that went, aha, I can take this individual piece back to my organization. That's my intention when I do these. So the updates for what I call modern DevOps practice, I kind of showed through the GitHub earlier, is convert the ARM templates to bicep. There's no reason for them to be ARM. Leverage YAML templates, so we'll do some of that. Create the approvals on the stages. So I showed where there's, you gotta have a stage here before I approve the load test, that test environment, and then there'd be one for production. It changes the solution structure. I'm not a big fan of zipping it all up and deploying it because no one needs to see the README file to my code base in the app service that we deployed. But that's how this solution's configured. The other thing too I did in this is I'm trying to experiment a little bit on this one, is getting deeper in code spaces and dev containers. So what that is that's an IDE in the browser. So in GitHub, I can go ahead and I'll pull it up here and show you, but I'll have all my code in front of me, everything installed that I need to actually develop in the browser. Dev containers is the solution if you're not in GitHub and you can do it in VS Code. And what I'll do is it'll create a Docker image for you to do all your development on your local machine. And I'll show some of that too, but like anything like VS Code extensions, dependencies, all that will get installed in the image. So let me go back now. All right, so inside here, one other thing I did, and if you want to, I should say this in the beginning, feel free to ask questions at any point. Otherwise, it's kind of like watching on YouTube. And I want it to be interactive, right? I mean, we could all go Google this and YouTube it, but to be able to ask the questions live, go ahead.
Oh, I was just waiting for Rick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, come on, Rick.
Hey, Rick.
Hey, what's wrong with Rick?
All right, so inside here now, what I have is a GitHub repo. This is a copy of what we saw, but I've reorganized it. So inside here, first off, going through this list by list, the .dev container, that's the code space I was talking to you about. So what that code space is, and I thought I turned it on before I left. Maybe I didn't. Oh, here we go. Here's my IDE in the browser. So I can browse the code if I want. Oh, give me a second. Come on. It's already been built, so it shouldn't take too long. All right. So to kind of, what I think is kind of cool about this is that I can go ahead and say, yeah, for my environment here, it's going to load here. All the extensions I want for this project will self-load in the IDE. So it'll load there, hopefully. Check time. I think we're all right. Give it a minute. So you can see here in code spaces, the installed ones. I put the basic Azure ones, and I put Bicep in here. But yeah, it's kind of slick there. So next up here is I always structure my things as individual components at that folder level. If you're familiar with VS Code, one of the things is you open up the folder a lot of times. So with that, if we think about this solution, I've got my JavaScript, I've got my infrastructures code, I've got my JMeter test, and I've got my YAML code. So, and I put presentations in here because I put the PowerPoint in here because I'm trying to commit to learning in public, putting that out there. I'm not the best JavaScript developer. In fact, I have a bug. If anyone wants to help, they can, on what to do with the no modules. Working through that. I don't think you're supposed to check those in. I think that's a bad idea. Okay. So yeah, I'm flushing that out still. But yeah, Microsoft sample provided that. So now if I go to my infrastructure one, converted it to Bicep. So if you're unfamiliar with Bicep, there's parameters and parameter folders and modules. So these are the individual modules I'm installing. I put in log analytics in this because I throw this out there because not everyone's aware of it, is App Insights, I think starting next year, is going to require log analytics. So
That's actually out now.
It's out now?
That went February this year.
Okay, never mind then.
So it's workspace only.
Okay. So for the recording, what the comment was is that the workspace only is App Insights now. But I think they still support it if you have legacy. So then also I have my parameters file. This is just me personally. I always do environment.region.parameters.json, which is kind of nice because then if I want to do some stuff where a DR region or a primary, like a master or like a more powerful region, my primary one and a secondary, I can. Some of the stuff I play around with. Next up, I'll come back to the YAML actually, because that's probably going to be a little more to it. So this is the code. This is the JavaScript. I'm not a developer, so I just threw everything that didn't look like this stuff into the folder. So this is their deployment command line, so I just kept that there. I'm not using it. I probably should delete it if I'm being honest. This presentation's up there. And then the test, I threw the JMeter test out there, so that's all stored there. So what's going to happen is, and now I'm going to go to the YAML one here because it's kind of what pulls it together, is I'm going to use YAML templates. So if you've seen or worked with me before, you know what I like to do is I wrap everything and put it in a separate repository. You'd be surprised how many times where it's like, oh yeah, I got a test template already ready to go, and throw it out there. So I can reuse it. And then this one is the template itself. So what this does is I can use this template multiple times, even in the same pipeline, but pass in different parameters. So earlier when I was like, yeah, if I want to be able to toggle kind of that load test on off, what I've done here is you can see I've got this as a parameter. And let me try to make this larger too. I'll get there. But this way I could create, using the same pipeline, I can create the same template, can create a second pipeline and override the value. So then I can bypass it if I want. And if you notice here, I've still got to flush this out. This should be a template, but we'll go by. You see I've got checks in here for CI and CD. Basically, I'm going off of trunk based. So if this is the main, do a deployment. If it's not, don't even bother loading the deployment stages. And then down here, okay, if you want me to run load tests, this is true. Then we're going to loop through the environment objects and find the test one, find the regions, and then we're going to do this test stage YAML file. And this is where I try to do things plug and play. So even if you take away and go, I don't know how to do this, I've wrapped everything here into a stage template that you can go ahead and reference yourself. And how you would do that is if I go back here to my repositories, I didn't have this one up already. And they get a little bit of inception. You get templates inside templates for sure. For this one, the load test one is the one I'm going to pick on. I've got in here the parameters for load test. So where's the load test configuration value? If there's any secrets, the environment JSON, these are values that are provided at the Azure Load Test task. So I always bubble them up. I'll set them to whatever the default values actually are, but we override them if we need to. If we don't, no big deal. We take the defaults. So you can see here, this calls a job, load test execute job. If I go inside this and go load test execute job, this is where the inception part comes into play. All right, so I'm in the job. Now I'm going to call the task. So now I jump here to the task. And this is the task that actually does all the work. Where is it? I preface it with Azure. We'll figure. All right. There we go. So this is now that Azure Load Test task wrapped up and parameterized. So you can see here, everything is a parameter. By doing it this way, it lets me be able to say, with these tasks, a lot of times there might be updates to the task. And I need to make sure who's using the right versions. I can go into here and just change this at version, and everyone gets a new version that's referencing it. There's nothing there for that. So that's great and everything. And also, by the way, you've got everything in GitHub. I thought we were talking about ADO pipelines. So you can do some of that configuration with Azure DevOps. And this is a PSA for those out there because this happens all the time. ADO is not going anywhere. It always comes up. Is GitHub going to overtake ADO? Is ADO going to go away sometime? The message is that they're going to be integrated together. Prime examples are ADO has test cases, GitHub doesn't. So how are you going to solve for those type of things? And there's no plans either, I believe, to solve for that. So here, all told, this is what that CI/CD pipeline looks like. So you can see here's my build, and I publish. If I go to my artifacts here, rather than one zip file for everything, I'm grabbing that code folder, the infrastructure folder, and the test folder. The reason why I grab those three and not everything else is if I need to roll back a change or see what was done, these are the artifacts that are needed. If I need to roll back the infrastructure, it's a pipeline. I can just republish this pipeline to that stage, grab the version that was snapshotted there. And then I have the test too, because that's going to be needed for future stages to run that load test. So what happens then here, I've got this, and also too, some things I throw in there, the example didn't, is I run a what if. What if is similar to your Terraform plan. Matt kind of covered this and shows the changes your bicep is going to make. Then this is, actually, this is a better view. So you can see this is my dev deploy job. And let me make this a little bit wider if I can. I'll hover for you. So what this is this is doing the infrastructure to the dev environment first. If you weren't aware, I was just talking with Joel about this beforehand. They released something where now the job's default is to run in parallel. So if you do that, you have to specify the dependencies. So again, if you're keeping application code and infrastructure code together, you got to call the dependency on, hey, don't deploy the app code until the infrastructure is there. So that does that piece. This one here will then deploy the code, and this is to the dev. And I did a second one just to kind of show, usually when I do these types of things, I always do at least 2 environments to make sure my assumptions are right, and also to make sure I can customize it going forward, because you might have different controls in place. So with that, here's the test. So this is the same thing, but a different parameters file potentially. It runs the test, then the load test. And if you remember when I did this, I said, hey, I would want an approval to control when that runs. Well, I did that here. And if you're unfamiliar with how this is possible, inside YAML pipelines, you can have environments set up. And inside the environment, I can go here, and I can do approvals and checks. Now, the reason too I would do this is your set of approvals as to who approves the load test and who approves production, probably gonna be different people, honestly. You're probably gonna have a product owner or maybe someone in the business on production if you're really mature enough to be able to do that. And then test, you probably have some testers, maybe a developer who can go ahead and click the button. But to kind of show what this looks like then is, let me go back to my pipeline. I can just go into this and I will hit review and approve. And that'll kick off the next one. Now, this is actually going to fail because I got issues with my JavaScript, and I got to figure that out. And it's probably because I took apart and parsed things. But if you want to follow the repo and stuff, I'm sure I'll be fixing it soon. because I think there's value in this and trying to polish this up. Feel free and provide that feedback if it's not valuable, because that's also important to know. So let me come back here to my PowerPoint and pull up the end slide. Any questions, comments? We got some time. I can dive into some things too. I got no problem doing that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can we take a peek at what the log analytics query would look like to see the errors that might pop up from load testing?
I don't think I have that fully configured.
Okay.
But I will make a note of that because
Okay.
I like that as a demo because that gives that end to end. I like that. I haven't thought of that. So
I guess we'll have like accurate abilities to accurate your errors together.
yeah. And to be honest too, if you didn't, I think I was talking to some people. I've done the first half of this before with just going through the tutorial, but then the second half, this is the first time presenting the actual YAML pieces of it and the deployment and the split outs. But that's great feedback. Yeah.
This Azure Load Testing is there, right? So is it by default it's available in Azure portal, or we need to install any add-ins?
Okay. So the question, because this is a recording, is if for Azure Load Testing, do you need any defaults, or do you need to install anything in the portal to make it available? It should be available unless you have admins who have disabled that service. It should be available for you to go ahead and do that. There might be limitations on the regions. I can check that, but I don't know if it's not available in all the regions. I know that. But there's that. And then you're going to want to have the added RBAC permission for the Azure Load Test contributor, I think it was. And then the third one is if you're using the agent, if you're doing it through CI/CD, you're going to need that agent installed, that marketplace extension installed. Okay. Cool. Anything else?
I'd be curious, more just a question for the crowd too. Like,
No. I'll come back.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Coffee. For the crowd, how many people are actually running a load test as part of their pipeline
Good question.
to deploy?
Not yet.
How many people want to start doing that now that they've seen this capability? Yeah.
Okay. There's some good hands. That's a good call out.
I think that's one of the awesome values of this technology. And I think the other thing I want to point out, you didn't touch on, I think there's a huge business value that Azure Load Testing can actually test private sites.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes things like JMeter or other public.com testing suites needs to be a public URL to be able to hit that test. This you can configure with some special Azure magic, I'll just call it, to authenticate and basically hit your stage site that no one else can touch. So you can load test, a project that's not live yet, which I think is valuable for a lot of apps and sites out there.
And the other thing I want to piggyback off of that when we're talking about it, because I got asked this, is like, well, what if I've got an application that's on-prem, that has components on-prem, but it's Azure, like it's a hybrid mode. If you think about it, we're just simulating traffic. So you are going to simulate that traffic all the way down to your on-prem. So that's something too to consider. There's value there. Go ahead with the question.
So my question is, does it also maintain the history of the on-prem performance statistics? Like most of the performance tools don't have it. Now that we are integrating this, does Azure give me a history like last year?
Okay.
Is that my baseline?
So the question is how to keep track of history of the load test runs, right? There's a couple things. I don't know the limits on those. That might be a follow-up. So on that one, there's a couple methods that I would recommend for it. So first up, whenever I do anything in a pipeline, the pipeline artifact should be maintained if it went to production. So there's my failure like I said it would do. But let me go back to one that ran successfully. So if I go into this, so the first thing I like to do is anything that went to production, and I have this if you're interested in that YAML repository, is a stage that says, okay, you went to prod, go ahead and put a manual retention on the pipeline for 2-3 years. So my thought is with the DevOps practices, I want to be able to get back in any given point in time to something that went to production. So why I say that is inside here, you can download the CSV results. These aren't great, but it's one start. Again, there's multiple elements to this. So while this is downloading, and I'll pull this up, the question about log analytics was brought up. Log analytics will keep that history for you too. But again, I'm not going to keep, it's on my other screen. I'm not going to keep 3 years of log analytics history, right? That would be costly. Microsoft would want you to do that, but no one's going to want to do that. So I got the window up. I'm trying to do it from here. Let's come over here. But you can see this isn't pretty. So it keeps the history there if you wanted to in a CSV format, and it's part of the pipeline artifact, which honestly I do think that's a good practice to do, because then you have everything that was generated from that pipeline as well. And then the other one, and this is one where I'd have to look up, is I've been playing around with this, and this has probably been going on for maybe a month. So you can see it's got the history here. I don't know how long the retention is on this. Let's see if I go here, if there's anything. Quotas, no. I don't see anything here that will say it. I guess you could send the diagnostic settings to like a storage account offline, but again, that's ugly to try to siphon through that.
I would say it's over a year, because the stuff that you were working with last year with kind of that introductories, the test runs were still there, and I just need the resource on Friday. So.
Okay. So at least a year, but that the one caveat I'll throw out with that is what he's referring to. When I was at OST, I played with this when it was in private preview, I think, or public preview. Might have changed since then. So maybe they're like, yep, this costed Microsoft too much money to keep out there. I don't know what the cost is on artifact retention. So that's something we can look up.
I had a question about what you were mentioning regarding deploying to two environments.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do that, if you're making changes and you want to test out different scenarios, do you leave one environment as is, kind of as a control, and then the other one becomes your variable and you can compare the two results?
Haven't thought of that. What you can do inside here, though, if you ran a test recently, I did this beforehand. I didn't bake in the presentation because I thought the UI was kind of clunky, at least for this one, but just so that you know that's available. If I go into this, so let's say I've got my baseline one. Let's go ahead and say this one. If I go into this, this was the one I think we executed in the beginning of the meeting. You can see there's an error rate. It gives me the ability to compare. If I wanted to compare it, and let's go here to the one I increased the throughput on. Oh, I gotta select both. There we go. I gotta do this, compare, and it'll overlay it. But like I said, the UI didn't feel like it was quite there when I'm having to look at this to tell. So, but there is that ability natively. In terms of DevOps practices on that one, I'm not sure. I think it's going to vary by the organization because you're going to have to maintain the cost of that second environment. If you're going to keep like and there are people who have a staging environment for Trooper, like, oh, this is like the DMZ terminology, as we're going to lock this down. Maybe there's a use case for that. If you are doing that, I would highly recommend then that your infrastructure isn't always on. So you recreate it as you need to. Otherwise, you'll be paying the bill for no one to be using it.
So in your example, you had the two environments. Are
you
load balancing between the two, or are they two distinct?
They're two distinct environments. The way I separate that with the YAML piece of it, to give you an idea, and this is just how I think it through, is the individual stage. Each of those stages, if I go back to it, is using a different service connection. Yes, I'm in the same Azure environment because I don't have more than one subscription. But if I were to go into my, where is it? It's probably not going to be. No, I'm trying to find the service connection.
Some of the project settings.
Oh, thank you. All right. So if I go into this and I go, thought it was.
Cogwheel bottom left. I was just in here.
It's always great when you have people to help you. I was in here.
Is it that arrow up in the top left corner? So this going to be.
Oh, maybe they updated the UI. But I will say that I do have different service connections, and the service connections scope the different subscriptions. So to your point there is the stage only has access, and the stages and the jobs under it only have access to the subscription the service connection has access to, which you can even take another level farther and do a resource group. Personally, I don't recommend that because it adds a lot of overhead, because then you're maintaining service connections for every resource group that's out there. Anything else? Or any other questions?
John, can you talk a little bit about why, if you're making a test, why at the beginning of your first test you had a slow ramp up of users and then you powered through more? Talk about that theory a little bit.
making me stretch a little bit. So the question was, can you explain why you'd ramp up your users rather than doing a big bulk approach? My understanding is because no one actually does. There's always a ramp up to users, right? And there's cold starts as well. So your Azure resources are going to scale potentially. So you're not going to get a true scaling out, I believe. You know the answer better than I do. Feel free to chime in.
I would answer the same way, but I would just add any .NET application typically has a spin up time.
Okay.
And the first request triggers the spin up of the application. You don't necessarily want to flood 50 concurrent users all the exact first time because that's not a true real world scenario. So you want to kind of warm up the app, especially if there's caching logic or other integrations that pull in data. You do that a little bit at a time because typically that's going to be a production state, and then you hit a lot of users after that once you simulate the load.
So for the recording, the answer is that there's enough time for like a .NET application to build up because 50 users hitting it at once isn't going to be a true test. So, and also if you have any caching, was also called out. Any other? Go ahead.
If the name is load testing in our virtual machines, which is owned by us, I will use an agent. So agent I will run it in my local VMs. Does it cost?
So before I say that, let me ask: is that when you're saying the local VM, you're talking about like an Azure self-hosted agent, or you talk? Okay, okay.
Not self-hosted agent. I mean, one agent which we have separate VMs, so which will connect to their VMs, but those VMs are managed by us. So in that case, really cost.
So the question is, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is that if I have my own self-hosted agent that I have access to and I install this task, and where's the bill, really, right? So the answer on this bill is it's just like an Azure service. It's not going to go to the VM. It's going to go to the Azure subscription because that's the way this is being done. Yep, so it'll be at the subscription level, and there'll be a line in item in the invoice. I haven't checked the invoice personally, but pretty confident with the way the billing works on that you will probably see a line item one to say the Azure load instance, and then you'll get that $10 a month rate, prorate depending upon whenever it is, and then the additional hours if you go over.
Even the integration costs, that's what you said. The JMeter integration.
So the JMeter integration is built in. So the question is about JMeter integration task or cost. No, you upload the JMeter script there, and then it's going to run in Azure. That's why when we hit that Azure load test, it took a little while to execute because it's ramping up the agent, it's getting the JMeter script ready for you, and it's executing in Azure. It's not executing on the local VM. Anything else? Okay. Again, I will pull this up here. I didn't put my email on this slide. I probably should. But you can click the link there. I know my repository out there has got my contact information on too. It's just my first name last name at Microsoft.com. Feel free to provide feedback. If you want, I'll stick around here, ask any questions. No one has anything else. I'll hand this over to Brian to kind of close it out.
Oh, wow. Let's make it an official with the microphone. I'm just going to hold it. Also. All right. Well, thanks a lot, John. Great presentation on load testing. So the rest of today's time is really about networking and getting to know each other. We can open it up to that as well. Just a couple closing things for me. Microsoft was kind enough to give us some giveaways. So please feel free. I feel like the last couple meetings, people have been afraid of this part of the table. And I haven't seen too many takers for that. And Mike will be very disappointed if we do not take his stuff. So please, anyway, grab a sticker at least. You can give it to someone back at your office. Next month, we have a speaker and a topic and a location already lined up. So again, it'll be the second Tuesday next month in May. I have a good friend of mine flying up from Florida to actually speak. His name is Brian Soltis. He works at Microsoft, technically Microsoft Germany, but I'll let him tell that story because that's part of his appeal. But he's a cloud solution architect, and he has been working on Azure naming, and he has a tool called the Azure Naming Tool. It's now part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's published in the Microsoft Docs on Learn, and I think in GitHub too. But it's something that can help you with naming governance, especially if you're a large organization. I think, naming is the second hardest problem in computer science, right? With the other problem being off by one errors. So It's a great way to kind of standardize naming. I think it's a fantastic thing that you could take and use in your organization. So that's why I think it's a good global topic, because it doesn't matter what you're naming, you should have a naming structure, and then you can use that tool. So he'll talk about that. Cameron, where's Cameron? Cameron has graciously agreed to host our next event. So Cameron, you want to tell everyone kind of where that's going to be?
Yeah, not too far from here, just by 6th Street Bridge in the Riverview Center building. Our office is kind of in the basement, so yeah.
Cool.
Just another local IT company, so yeah, we're on the host.
Thank you. Thank you. So those details will be on the Meetup page as well. And we can kind of leave it at that as far as planning. But again, please, we're looking for more topics that interest you all. We're looking for more speakers if you'd like to speak at any monthly event. And any other feedback you have about the sessions and the way this is going, please let us know, because we're going to meet. I think Kim and I and potentially John and a few others are going to meet around, like, we've done 3 or 4 of these now this year. How are things going? What would we change? What would we improve? So please, now is a good time to give us some feedback on these things. And I hope you all found value of coming out. Got some shaking heads. It's cool. So with that, again, feel free to network for the next half hour or 20 minutes or whatever we are left, 25 minutes. And we'll go from there.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.